I remember the exact moment the air in the room shifted, the moment my father's hand struck my cheek. I was 27, standing in the marble-clad office of the family estate, the kind of space that screamed wealth but never warmth. The walls were lined with expensive art that had probably never stirred a genuine feeling in anyone but him, and the sunlight slicing through the blinds painted lines across the polished wooden floor. I could feel the sting on my face, the sudden burning humiliation, and yet the emotional weight that followed was far heavier than the physical pain. "Lila," he spat, his voice cold and jagged, each syllable like ice against my skin. "You'll get nothing. Not a dime of my fortune." I froze. $250 million was more than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams, yet the number had always been irrelevant compared to what I truly craved: acceptance. A simple acknowledgement that I belonged, that I was his daughter, that my existence mattered in this gilded world. But now, in the shadow of that slap, all that desire for validation felt like a cruel joke. My father's lawyers had already handed me the amended will, and the words stared back at me with sharp, calculated precision, removed from inheritance. I wanted to scream, to plead, to argue, but the words lodged in my throat like jagged stones. My mother wasn't there. She had left years ago when I was barely a teenager, citing irreconcilable differences and a need for freedom. That absence had hollowed out a part of me long before this moment, leaving me searching for approval from a man who seemed incapable of unconditional love. And now it was gone entirely. I sank into the black leather chair across from him, hands trembling slightly as I tried to collect myself. My father leaned back, eyes cold, unyielding, and I realized something terrifying. I had been invisible to him for years, perhaps never truly seen as his own. The room, the wealth, the privilege, they were meaningless if I wasn't recognized in the one place that had always mattered: his heart. The lawyers shuffled papers beside him, their faces carefully neutral, professional. One of them, a middle-aged woman with sharp glasses, cleared her throat. "Lila, there's more," she said, and I thought I couldn't handle another blow. I braced myself for more rejection, more details about how unworthy I supposedly was in my father's eyes. But what came next shattered every expectation I had. "You were kidnapped as a baby," she said, her voice clinical, almost rehearsed. "Documents from the hospital and police reports, once cross-verified, confirm that your biological parents lost you in a custody breach. Your father adopted you legally at 3 years old, unaware until recently of the full circumstances surrounding your early life." The words echoed through me like a hammer striking glass. My mind, already frayed from anger and humiliation, snapped for a second. Kidnapped? Me? The life I thought I had, my name, my identity, the narrative of belonging, crumbled like dust through my fingers. I wanted to cry, to laugh, to vomit, anything but sit there stunned. I remembered the vague traces of my childhood that never made sense. The woman in the orphanage who called me Little One instead of my given name, the discrepancies in birth records, the whispers I had dismissed as childish imagination. And now, in one cruel revelation, it all came together. My existence had been orchestrated by circumstances far beyond my control, and the man who slapped me, who denied me what he claimed I deserved, had never truly known me, or perhaps never wanted to. I took a deep breath, trying to anchor myself. My father watched silently, his lips pressed into a tight line. It wasn't anger or shame in his eyes. It was a calculating coldness, as though my identity crisis was merely an inconvenience, disrupting his day. I realized, painfully, that this wasn't about money or inheritance alone. It was about control, about power, about shaping a reality where my existence could be erased, ignored, or denied. My hands shook, and I looked down at my fingers, tracing the faint scars of past arguments, past attempts to reach him. So many moments when I had tried to earn love or acknowledgement, when I had bent myself into shapes he could approve of, when I had whispered words of hope and loyalty that bounced off walls of indifference. And now, with a slap and a legal document, I was unmade. "Why?" I whispered, almost to myself. Why would you do this? He didn't answer. Not immediately. He only adjusted the cuff of his designer shirt, leaned back, and exhaled as if that one slap had completed the transaction of his displeasure. The lawyers glanced at each other, eyes flicking between us, and I realized I was on my own in this storm. I left the office without another word, my heels clicking on the marble floor. Each step reverberated like a countdown to the life I thought I knew and the truth I had yet to face. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the smell of autumn leaves and distant rain, yet it did nothing to calm the fire in my chest. I wanted to scream at the sky, at him, at the unfairness of it all, but instead, I clutched my purse, head bowed, and tried to breathe. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the city lights flickering outside my window, and replayed every memory in my mind. The father who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to love me unconditionally, had turned on me. The fortune that was supposedly mine by birthright was no longer a birthright at all. And the revelation of being kidnapped as a baby made me feel both betrayed and untethered, like a ship cast adrift without a map or anchor. I remembered my mother's departure, the loneliness of adolescence, and the moments when I had clung to the illusion of family warmth. It all collided with the slap, the will, and the kidnapping revelation, leaving me raw, exposed, and aching. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, eyes wide with shock, cheeks still flushed from humiliation, and yet a subtle flicker of something stronger, survival. Because despite everything, I knew I had to endure. I knew I had to navigate a world where my identity had been stolen, manipulated, and questioned. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the slap, the stolen inheritance, or the years lost to a lie. But I could begin to reclaim my life, piece by piece. I started by calling a private investigator, someone who could help me trace my biological parents, verify the details of my kidnapping, and uncover the hidden history that had been kept from me. Every call felt like a small act of rebellion, a step toward reclaiming control in a life that had been orchestrated by others. The process was painstaking, filled with bureaucratic hurdles, confidential documents, and endless phone calls, but each discovery, each new piece of information, strengthened my resolve. I also began documenting my emotions, writing late into the night in a leather-bound journal that had become my sanctuary. Each entry was a raw, unfiltered release of anger, grief, confusion, and determination. I wrote about the slap, about the exclusion from the will, about the betrayal of being kidnapped and raised without consent. And I wrote about my dreams, my hopes to find my true family, to discover who I really was, and to one day confront the tangled web of lies that had shaped my life. Through this process, I met a lawyer who specialized in inheritance disputes and kidnapping cases. She was sharp, compassionate, and unyielding, and she became my guide through the legal maze that awaited. Together, we began to unravel the documents, uncover discrepancies, and prepare for the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. Each meeting was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it gave me a sense of purpose and a glimmer of hope. The weeks blurred into months, but my determination only grew. I visited archives, hospitals, and police stations, piecing together a timeline of my early life. Every new revelation brought with it a mix of relief and sorrow, relief that the truth was finally coming to light, and sorrow for the years spent in ignorance, for the stolen childhood, and for the father who had treated me as expendable. I also leaned on a close friend, Sophie, who had known me since college. She listened to every tearful phone call, every late-night voice message, and every whispered fear. She became my anchor, the reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this turbulent journey. "You are stronger than they think," she would say, and slowly, I began to believe it myself. By the end of that first year, I had uncovered significant evidence about my kidnapping and established a clearer understanding of my biological origins. But even with clarity, the emotional wound inflicted by my father's slap and his exclusion from the will was raw. I realized that understanding the truth wouldn't erase the pain, wouldn't automatically grant me closure, but it was the first step toward reclaiming my life and my identity. And so I took a deep breath, looking out over the city from my small apartment balcony, and whispered to myself, I will not be broken by this. I will reclaim my life, my story, and my name. That night, for the first time since the slap, I felt a flicker of empowerment. Not from revenge, not from money, but from the understanding that I still had the power to shape my destiny, to define who I was, and to confront the shadows of a family that had betrayed me. The revelation about being kidnapped lingered in my mind like a persistent shadow, following me everywhere. Even the simplest moments, walking down the street, buying groceries, or answering emails, were haunted by the knowledge that my life had been built on a lie. I was Lila, the daughter my father had legally adopted, yet my earliest memories belonged to another set of parents whose faces I had never truly known. The thought twisted my stomach every morning. I started by reviewing old photographs and documents I had access to, any piece of paper that could hold a clue. I had childhood photos lined up in my apartment, the kind you keep on shelves not to display, but to examine in quiet desperation. There were images of me with my father, smiling awkwardly at family gatherings, celebrating birthdays, and wearing oversized dresses he had bought. I had always assumed that the smiles reflected a genuine bond, but now, under the harsh light of truth, they felt hollow. It was all a performance, a script I didn't know I was reading from until the final act had blindsided me. My father's slap replayed in my mind endlessly. I could feel the heat of his palm on my cheek, the sting radiating as both physical punishment and symbolic erasure. He had the power to cut me out of his $250 million fortune, and he did so without hesitation, as if I were disposable. And yet, the kidnapping revelation shifted something in me. It made me question what family even meant. Bloodlines, legal documents, wealth, appearances, they suddenly seemed inconsequential compared to honesty, safety, and trust, things I had been deprived of from the start. I reached out to private investigators and legal experts to trace my biological origins. Each step felt like peeling back layers of my own identity, revealing fragments I had never imagined. Hospital records confirmed that I had been abducted from maternity ward, snatched in the confusion of a busy morning, and placed with a couple who, years later, had chosen to let my father adopt me legally. The documents were cold, factual, almost indifferent to the emotional chaos they wrought. But reading each line, I felt a strange mixture of grief, anger, and relief. Relief that the truth existed, that my story was not entirely lost in secrecy. Every piece of information added to the weight I carried. I found a police report, partially redacted, describing the initial search, and it broke me in ways I hadn't expected. I imagined my real parents frantic, desperate, praying, and pleading. They had mourned a daughter they couldn't find, while I had grown up believing I was fully part of another family, only to discover that the foundation was stolen. I couldn't decide whether to hate my adoptive father more for the slap or for the ignorance, or whether to hate the circumstances that had stolen my earliest years. I also started reaching out to relatives on my biological side, the distant connections I had never known existed. Each phone call and email carried the tension of tentative hope and fear. Would they reject me? Would they welcome me? I felt like a trespasser in a life that had continued without me, a visitor showing up to a party I had been barred from attending. Some responses were warm, cautious, filled with the trembling gratitude of people reconnecting after decades of loss. Others were skeptical, suspicious, reluctant to open doors that had been closed for years. Every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope of emotion, with the knowledge that any misstep could shatter the fragile bridge forming between the past I'd never known and the present I was now forced to navigate. Meanwhile, my father remained a looming, invisible presence in my daily life. He did not apologize, nor did he offer an explanation for the slap or for cutting me out of the will. His interactions were perfunctory, professional, and chillingly cold. Meetings with his legal team felt like interrogations, each one emphasizing that my existence in his world was negotiable, conditional, and expendable. I realized that he wasn't cruel because of ignorance. He was cruel because control mattered more than love, because power mattered more than family. And yet, Part of me still clung to the hope that he might recognize the person I had become, that he might see my resilience, my intelligence, my strength. I threw myself into research, legal preparation, and self-discovery. Nights blurred into early mornings as I pored over records, cross-referenced documents, and created timelines of events. I interviewed witnesses, spoke with medical staff from the time of the kidnapping, and retraced the steps of my adoptive family's early legal proceedings. It was painstaking, emotionally draining, but also oddly empowering. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming some control over my own narrative. The journey wasn't only bureaucratic or investigative. I had to confront the psychological toll as well. I began therapy with a compassionate psychologist who specialized in trauma and identity crises. Together, we worked through waves of grief, anger, and betrayal. I learned to separate the child I had once been from the adult I had become. I learned that the slap, the will, and the kidnapping revelation were not reflections of my worth. They were reflections of other people's failures, limitations, and moral compromises. One afternoon, while sitting in her softly lit office, I asked my therapist a question that had been echoing in my mind for months. How do I forgive someone for a life stolen and a father who struck me? She looked at me with calm intensity and said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing their actions. It means refusing to let their cruelty define your life. It means reclaiming the story for yourself." That statement struck me like a lightning bolt. Perhaps this was what I had been searching for all along. Not revenge, not validation, not wealth, but a reclamation of agency. With renewed focus, I began documenting every encounter with my father and his lawyers, creating a meticulous record of interactions, letters, and legal notices. Each entry was cathartic, each detail painstakingly logged as if assembling armor around my fragile emotional core. The process helped me see patterns of manipulation, control, and denial. Seeing them objectively, I realized that my father's actions were not random. They were deliberate, designed to assert dominance and erase me from his narrative. But knowing this also gave me clarity. I could now respond strategically rather than reactively, using information as my shield. Outside the legal and investigative world, I explored personal reconnections. I met with a distant cousin from my biological family, a warm, soft-spoken woman who embraced me immediately as family. She shared photographs, stories, and letters I had never seen, opening windows to a past that was mine by blood and by right, even if it had been inaccessible for decades. That connection, fragile but profound, helped soothe the aching sense of displacement I had carried all my life. For the first time, I could imagine a version of family that was real, supportive, and genuine, something I had longed for but never fully experienced. And yet, the shadow of my adoptive father lingered. Each discovery about my biological roots and each newfound connection only heightened the contrast between the warmth I was beginning to experience and the cold, transactional nature of the life I had left behind. The slap, the will, the denial, they became symbols not just of betrayal, but of the hollow power dynamics I had endured. I realized that my story was not just about wealth or inheritance. It was about identity, truth, and reclaiming dignity in a world that had tried to erase me. One evening, I received an unexpected letter from my father's lawyers. It was terse, professional, but hinted at a new revelation. They had uncovered additional documents that could clarify the circumstances of my early childhood. My heart raced, a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Every new document could change my understanding of my life, either confirming what I already suspected or revealing new layers of complexity. I was ready. I had spent months preparing emotionally, legally, and mentally for this very moment. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings and document reviews. The papers revealed the chaotic aftermath of the kidnapping, the legal proceedings that had resulted in my adoption, and the way my father had been misled by incomplete information for years. It became clear that while he had legally adopted me, he had also been influenced by advisors who prioritized wealth, status, and appearances over human connection. Each page, each signature, each note added depth to the narrative, painting a portrait of a man driven by ego and control rather than love or compassion. By the end of the week, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. Exhaustion from months of investigation, endless emotional turmoil, and navigating family politics. Empowerment from the clarity I had gained, the connections I had forged, and the knowledge that my life, stolen though it had been, could now be directed by my choices rather than the whims of others. I realized that I no longer needed my father's acknowledgement to validate my existence. I had my own agency, my own story, and a burgeoning sense of self-worth that could not be erased by a slap, a will, or a lifetime of deception. I stood on my apartment balcony that evening, looking over the city as lights flickered below. The air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of rain and autumn leaves. I thought about the girl I had been, the woman I had become, and the journey that lay ahead. I whispered to myself, I am more than their lies. I am more than their cruelty. I am my own person. And for the first time in years, I believed it. The days following the revelations were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings, but they also became a crucible in which I began to discover my own resilience. I was 27, navigating the sharp edges of betrayal and identity crises, yet somewhere amid the chaos, a quiet determination began to take root. Every document I examined, every witness I spoke to, every story from my biological family felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I remember one afternoon vividly, the sunlight filtering through the blinds of my small apartment, casting golden lines across my kitchen table, cluttered with files, letters, and printed photographs. I was sitting there, my hazel eyes scanning the latest batch of adoption records, when the reality hit me again. For decades, my life had been orchestrated by other people's choices, by fate, by chance. And yet, I was the one living it. I was the one who had to navigate this storm. That realization was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. I decided to meet my biological mother. Her name was Claudia, a woman in her early 50s with kind, tired eyes, a gentle smile, and hands that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of worry. We met at a small cafe, quiet, tucked away from the bustling streets outside, a neutral space where we could confront decades of absence and longing. The first moments were awkward, filled with hesitant glances and tentative words. She reached across the table, and I instinctively grasped her hand, a silent acknowledgement that despite the lost years, there was a connection neither time nor circumstance could sever. I never stopped looking for you, Claudia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Every day, I hoped somehow you were safe, that you were loved. Her eyes glistened, and I felt an ache in my chest that was equal parts grief and relief. I wanted to tell her that I had been safe, yes, but not truly loved, not in the way a child needs from her parents. I wanted to tell her about the slap, the will, the coldness, the betrayal. But instead, I nodded and let the silence hold some of the weight between us. Meeting Claudia was like touching a part of myself that had always been missing. She showed me photographs from my early months, letters she had written and never sent, and even a small box of trinkets I had left behind in infancy. I ran my fingers over the worn edges of tiny baby shoes and a faded blanket, and tears pricked my eyes. I realized that while my life had been stolen, fragments of it had been preserved, waiting for me to reclaim. As I continued my investigation into my early life, I began to piece together the timeline of my kidnapping. The more I learned, the angrier I became, not at my biological parents, but at the system, at the people who had enabled the abduction, and at the advisors and lawyers who had manipulated my adoptive father for years. The slap, the exclusion from the will, it wasn't just personal cruelty. It was the result of a larger pattern of control, deceit, and ego-driven decisions that had left me feeling like a pawn in a game I never agreed to play. Despite my anger, I also began to notice a shift in myself. I was no longer the timid, deferential daughter who had once sought approval at any cost. I had seen the worst of betrayal, the sting of humiliation, and yet I had survived. That survival became a foundation, a bedrock of confidence that I could lean on. I realized I didn't need to fight him directly to reclaim my life. I could build a new reality, one where I was in control, one where my worth was not dictated by inheritance, bloodlines, or the whims of a man who had shown me nothing but conditional affection. I also reached out to distant relatives on my biological father's side. The meetings were cautious at first, filled with skepticism and questions.
Who was I?
Could I be trusted? Was this a scam? Slowly, through patience, honesty, and sharing of documents, bonds began to form. I learned about my biological father's family, about traditions, stories, and values that I had never experienced but somehow felt instinctively familiar. Every shared laugh, every shared tear, every moment of connection was a small triumph, a reclamation of belonging that had been denied to me for decades. Amidst all this, I started to confront my adoptive father legally. His lawyers remained a constant presence, calm, professional, and unyielding, as if emotion were a luxury I no longer deserved. I demanded clarity about the reasoning behind my exclusion from the will, scrutinized every amendment, every clause, every notarized page. The process was grueling, filled with tension, but it also provided a strange clarity. I realized that the man who had slapped me and erased me from his wealth was not infallible. He was human, flawed, and bound by the manipulations and fears of his own ego. One late evening, I received a call from one of the lawyers who had handled the original adoption case. She spoke in hushed tones, aware that the details were sensitive. "Lila," she said, "there are documents you need to see. They confirm more about your early life, about your kidnapping, your time in foster care, and the circumstances that led to your adoptive father's decisions." My heart raced as she emailed me the scanned files. I spent hours poring over them, each page revealing a new layer of truth, a puzzle piece that finally fit into place. The narrative of my stolen life was becoming complete, yet the emotional resonance was overwhelming. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, surrounded by open files, letters, and photographs, and crying like I hadn't cried in years. The tears weren't just for the injustice, the slap, or the lost inheritance. They were for the years of identity confusion, the longing for a family that truly saw me, and the ache of knowing that some moments of my childhood could never be reclaimed. And yet, beneath the grief, there was a spark, a recognition that I had survived, that I was navigating a path toward empowerment, that the truth, however painful, was finally mine to hold. During this period, I also started reconnecting with friends and mentors I had distanced myself from. Their support was invaluable. They reminded me that my worth was not defined by my father's wealth or my adoptive status. Every conversation, every coffee meetup, every reassuring text reinforced the realization that family wasn't solely determined by blood or money. It was built on trust, support, and shared experiences. I began to assemble a network that was real, affirming, and emotionally nourishing, something I had never experienced fully in my adoptive family. Meanwhile, my professional life became an anchor. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, channeling my emotions into tangible accomplishments. Projects I had once approached with trepidation now became arenas for demonstration of skill, leadership, and creativity. My colleagues noticed the shift, a subtle yet unmistakable air of confidence, someone who had weathered storms and emerged resilient. Even small successes became symbolic victories in a life that had long been defined by betrayal and uncertainty. By the time 6 months had passed since the slap and the revelation, I had constructed a narrative of my life that was grounded in truth, resilience, and empowerment. I understood that the slap, the exclusion from the will, and the kidnapping were not just events, they were catalysts, forcing me to confront pain, reclaim agency, and redefine what family and self-worth truly meant. The day I finally met my biological father, a man in his mid-50s with deep-set eyes and a hesitant smile, I felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. Would he reject me? Would he embrace me? Our first conversation was awkward, filled with stilted pleasantries, tentative questions, and cautious revelations. But gradually, through shared stories and memories, a bond began to form. He spoke of regrets, of missed years, of longing to know the child he had lost. I listened, absorbing the complexity of his emotions, the humanity behind the man who had been absent for decades. Throughout all of this, my adoptive father remained a looming presence in the background, an unresolved tension. Yet, I began to understand that his significance in my life had shifted. He could no longer define my identity, dictate my worth, or control my emotional reality. The slap had once felt like annihilation, but now, reframed by truth, investigation, and self-discovery, it was merely a moment, one among many, that I had survived and learned from. In quiet moments, I reflected on the paradoxical journey I had endured. I had been kidnapped, raised by strangers, slapped by a man who claimed to be my father, and cut from a vast fortune. And yet, through every twist, every betrayal, every revelation, I had discovered a capacity for strength and resilience I hadn't known existed. I was no longer simply Lila, the daughter of my adoptive father. I was Lila, a survivor, a seeker of truth, a woman reclaiming her identity, one document, one conversation, and one connection at a time. By the end of the year, I had established meaningful relationships with both biological parents, built a supportive network of friends and mentors, and confronted the legal and emotional dimensions of my adoptive father's betrayal. I had emerged from the storm with a clarity of self that I had never known before. And while scars remained, memories of the slap, the exclusion, the stolen years, I had transformed them into markers of strength, evidence that I had endured, learned. The first time I saw the legal documents that would finally confirm the scope of my kidnapping, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. I was 27, but the weight of a lifetime of uncertainty pressed down on me as though I were carrying decades of unanswered questions on my own shoulders. The papers were crisp, each signature and stamp echoing a narrative I had only begun to understand. The narrative that my life, the identity I had assumed, had been built on a foundation of secrecy, manipulation, and loss. I had spent months gathering evidence, speaking to lawyers, investigators, and even some of my biological family who had long wondered where I had gone. Each meeting, each phone call, each painstakingly traced document became a stitch in the patchwork of my emerging truth. And yet, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack before me, I realized that understanding the facts would not automatically ease the emotional turbulence that had consumed me since my father's slap and the revelation of my kidnapping. The slap, in particular, had left more than just a physical mark. It had carved a hole in my confidence, a deep fissure in my sense of belonging. That moment in my father's office, with the weight of $250 million and rejection pressing down, had made me feel invisible, worthless, and disposable. And now, knowing that I had been kidnapped, that my early years had been stolen, and that the father I had thought was my protector could also be my tormentor, the emotional complexity felt almost unbearable. I reached for my journal and began writing, a ritual I had come to rely on to process the storm of emotions. Each sentence poured out layers of grief, anger, confusion, and fragile hope. I wrote about my adoptive father, about the slap, about the lawyers and the documents. I wrote about Claudia, my biological mother, and the tentative, fragile bond we were forming. I wrote about the people I was meeting, the pieces of myself that had been scattered across time, and the realization that while my past could not be undone, my present and future were still mine to shape. One evening, after a long day of reviewing files and making calls, I sat on my apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below like a constellation of possibilities. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and autumn leaves. I thought about the woman I had been, a girl who had sought validation from a father who was incapable of giving it, who had clung to a life that was never truly hers, and the woman I was becoming. The anger still burned, but it was tempered by clarity and purpose. I could no longer allow my father's actions, or the circumstances of my kidnapping, to define me entirely. I had to reclaim agency over my own story. It was around this time that I began meeting more of my biological relatives. Each encounter was tentative at first, a delicate dance of trust, questions, and cautious warmth. My biological father, a man with deep-set eyes and a hesitant smile, had waited decades to meet me. His words were tentative, filled with regret and longing, but they carried a sincerity that was unfamiliar yet comforting. "I never stopped thinking about you," he admitted during our first meeting, and I felt an odd combination of sorrow for the lost years and relief that I finally had a tangible connection to my origins. Claudia, my biological mother, became a constant source of support. She shared stories, photographs, letters, and fragments of a life I had never lived. The process was emotional, often leaving me in tears as I tried to reconcile the past with my present. She spoke of the nights she had cried for a daughter she couldn't find, the relentless hope that I was alive, the despair of not knowing where I had gone. And while I had experienced my own grief and abandonment, hearing her perspective added depth to my understanding, a shared empathy that bridged decades of absence. Meanwhile, my adoptive father remained a looming figure, though now his presence had shifted from paternal authority to legal and emotional complexity. He had not reached out, had not apologized, had not attempted to explain the slap or the exclusion from the will. His lawyers maintained a professional distance, yet each interaction reminded me that he still held power over my past, if not my future. I realized that part of reclaiming my life meant confronting this power, not with rage alone, but with strategy, clarity, and self-assuredness. I began to work with a legal team to explore options regarding the will, the inheritance, and potential reparations for the emotional and legal injustices I had endured. The process was meticulous, emotionally draining, and fraught with tension. Every clause, every amendment, every notarized page was scrutinized for implications, inconsistencies, and leverage. I discovered how careful navigation of the legal system could provide not only clarity, but also a sense of control that I had been denied for so long. At the same time, I devoted energy to building a life beyond legal battles. I reconnected with friends I had distanced myself from, leaned on mentors for guidance, and immersed myself in work that demanded focus and skill. These activities were not distractions but rather lifelines, anchoring me in a reality where my worth was defined by my actions, my choices, and my relationships, not by the wealth or cruelty of my adoptive father. I also explored therapy more deeply, attending sessions that forced me to confront buried emotions and long-held fears. I realized that the slap, the exclusion, and the kidnapping were not merely events. They were catalysts, revealing vulnerabilities, testing resilience, and shaping identity. Through therapy, I learned to process these traumas without allowing them to consume me. I learned that my anger, grief, and confusion were valid, but they did not have to define the trajectory of my life. One particularly cold evening, I found myself walking through a quiet park near my apartment. The leaves rustled underfoot, and the distant hum of the city seemed to fade. I thought about the woman I had been, the child who had been stolen, the girl who had longed for validation, and the adult I was becoming. I whispered to myself, I am more than the sum of their betrayals. I am more than stolen years and hollow gestures. I am my own person. That affirmation, repeated quietly but firmly, felt like a shield against the lingering bitterness and a promise of future agency. Amid these reflections, I began tentative steps toward forgiveness, not for my father's sake, not because I condoned the slap or the exclusion, but because forgiveness, in my mind, was about liberation. Forgiveness would allow me to move forward, unburdened by the need for retribution, though I did not discount the possibility of legal recourse. It was about reclaiming my emotional autonomy, choosing to define my identity on my own terms rather than through the lens of others' cruelty. Meeting my biological family also allowed me to explore a new sense of belonging. Holidays, small family gatherings, and shared stories provided fragments of what I had been denied in childhood. Each connection was tentative, delicate, but it was real, unlike the transactional relationships that had defined my adoptive life. Slowly, I began to understand that family was not merely a legal construct or a bank account. It was love, trust, empathy, and presence. Despite the healing, the shadow of betrayal lingered. The slap and the exclusion from the will were stark reminders that my adoptive father's view of me was rooted in control and ego. Yet, rather than allowing bitterness to fester, I channeled that energy into growth, research, and empowerment. Every day, I reaffirmed my worth not through inheritance but through action, discovery, and relationships built on authenticity. Months passed, and the network of support around me solidified. Claudia and I became closer, sharing details of our lives, supporting each other through challenges, and celebrating small victories. My biological father, though cautious, gradually opened up, sharing stories of my early life, regrets, and hopes. Together, these connections created a sense of grounded identity I had never known before, a foundation built on truth, compassion, and presence rather than wealth or pretense. In the evenings, I often revisited my apartment balcony, looking out over the city as lights shimmered like scattered stars. I reflected on the journey I had undertaken. The slap, the exclusion, the revelation of being kidnapped, the legal battles, and the slow, painstaking reconstruction of my identity. I realized that the scars I carried were not just wounds but also symbols of resilience, evidence that I had endured trials designed to break me and emerge stronger. I began to document my experiences more formally, writing in long, detailed journals about each revelation, encounter, and emotional milestone. I wrote about betrayal, humiliation, and loss, but I also wrote about growth, clarity, and empowerment. The act of writing became a way to consolidate my identity, to reclaim ownership over my narrative, and to ensure that the story of my life was told through my voice rather than filtered through the perspectives of those who had tried to erase me. As part of my self-discovery, I explored creative outlets that had been neglected during my years of conformity to my adoptive family's expectations. Painting, music, and even small projects of home organization became acts of autonomy and expression. I realized that reclaiming my life was not merely a legal or investigative journey. It was an emotional and personal evolution. Each stroke of a brush, each note sung in private, each decision made for my own well-being reinforced the idea that I was finally in control. And yet, amid all the progress, I never lost sight of the challenges that remained. My adoptive father's presence, while diminished in emotional significance, still carried weight in legal terms. The will, the inheritance, and the associated power dynamics required careful navigation, strategic planning, and a clear understanding of my rights. But I approached these challenges with a newfound confidence, tempered by experience and guided by truth. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of peace. Not because the past had changed, not because the betrayal had been erased, but because I had claimed the tools to. By this point, I had begun to feel the first glimmers of empowerment, yet the shadow of my adoptive father's actions still loomed large. Each encounter with his lawyers reminded me that the slap, the exclusion from the $250 million will, and the revelations about my kidnapping weren't simply past events. They were ongoing dynamics that affected my present and could influence my future. The legal battles were relentless, and the emotional toll was heavy, but I had grown stronger, more strategic, and more determined than ever. I remember sitting in a sleek conference room one morning, the sunlight reflecting off the polished table, stacks of documents meticulously organized in front of me. Across from me sat a senior attorney who had agreed to represent me through this difficult process. She was calm, professional, and unwavering, a steady anchor amid the storm of uncertainty. "Lila," she said, "your father's decisions regarding the will were deliberate, but there are avenues we can explore. You have rights, and we can assert them." Her words ignited a spark of hope within me, a sense that perhaps the scales of justice could be tilted, even slightly, in my favor. That day, I began drafting a comprehensive plan, a multi-layered strategy that addressed legal recourse, potential reconciliation, and the reconstruction of my personal identity. Every document I reviewed, every clause I analyzed, and every legal precedent I researched became a building block. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life story. For the first time, I felt a sense of agency, a recognition that despite decades of manipulation and betrayal, I could influence outcomes in my own favor. Yet empowerment did not erase the emotional scars. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city below slept, I often found myself staring at the ceiling, reliving moments of humiliation and pain. The slap, in particular, haunted me, not just the physical sting, but the humiliation, the sense of being invalidated by the very person who was supposed to love and protect me. Those memories were heavy, but I refused to let them define me. Instead, I allowed them to fuel my determination to reclaim my narrative. Amidst the legal strategizing, I continued to cultivate relationships with my biological family. Claudia had become a constant presence in my life, offering emotional support, sharing memories, and helping me navigate the turbulent waters of rediscovery. One afternoon, we sat together in a small park, sunlight dancing through the leaves, and she handed me a faded photo of me as a baby, wrapped in a tiny blanket she had kept for decades. "This was always yours," she said softly. The photo was fragile, the corners worn, but it symbolized continuity, love, and the life I had been denied. I held it close, feeling an emotional release I hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, I began reconnecting with friends and mentors who had once been part of my life, but had drifted away under the weight of my adoptive family's expectations and secrecy. Their support became an anchor. They reminded me of my worth, my intelligence, and my resilience. Every conversation reinforced the notion that my life did not have to be defined by betrayal and stolen inheritance, that I could build a reality anchored in trust, respect, and authenticity. Despite this progress, there were moments of raw anger that surged uncontrollably. I would think of the slap, the exclusion from the will, the years of ignorance imposed by my adoptive father, and my blood would boil. I found myself pacing my apartment, fists clenched, trying to channel the fury into constructive action. Therapy helped, offering tools to process these emotions without allowing them to spiral out of control. I learned to transform anger into focus, grief into motivation, and betrayal into clarity. During this period, I also began exploring the intricacies of my adoptive father's business empire. It was a world I had long observed from the periphery, filled with power plays, high-stakes decisions, and a culture of control and hierarchy. Understanding this environment was crucial, not because I sought revenge for revenge's sake, but because knowledge was power. I needed to comprehend the machinery that had excluded me from the will, that had enforced the slap, that had kept me in a state of emotional and financial subordination for decades. Every report, every ledger, every insider account became a tool to navigate and eventually reclaim some measure of authority. At the same time, I began documenting every interaction with my adoptive father's representatives. Emails, letters, phone conversations, and meetings were all meticulously recorded. Each entry was a piece of armor, a testament to my determination not to be undermined or dismissed. I realized that control, in their world, was exercised through manipulation and omission, but by meticulously recording events, I was creating my own form of control, transparency and clarity in a world designed to obscure. One evening, after a particularly intense day of meetings and document reviews, I found myself wandering through my apartment, touching objects, reading letters, and revisiting memories. I came across a small, framed photo of me as a child, taken during a birthday celebration with my adoptive family. The smiles, the cake, the balloons, all of it now felt bittersweet. I had loved them, or at least the idea of them, but the truth of betrayal had transformed the image. I realized that love alone could not protect against control, manipulation, and cruelty. And yet, acknowledging that truth allowed me to finally release the childlike hope that had clung to my father's approval. It was also during this period that I met with my biological father again, this time in a more private setting. We spoke for hours, sharing memories, regrets, and hopes. He expressed sorrow for the years we had lost, and I felt the weight of reconciliation begin to form. Our connection was tentative, but authentic. He had not been able to protect me as a child, yet as an adult, he offered guidance, insight, and support. In his presence, I felt a sense of belonging that I had long craved, a recognition that identity and family could be reconstructed, even after years of absence. The legal challenges remained complex. Each day brought new documents, unexpected clauses, and strategic obstacles. Yet, I approached them with a sense of purpose and calm I had never experienced before. I was no longer reacting purely out of emotion. I was thinking strategically, planning methodically, and acting decisively. Every step I took reinforced the realization that while my father had sought to control my past, I was now asserting authority over my present and future. Amidst all this, I continued to explore my own emotional resilience. Meditation, journaling, therapy, and small creative projects became tools for self-expression and grounding. I painted, wrote letters that I never sent, and organized personal spaces in ways that symbolized reclamation and order. Each act was a reminder that I could create stability and beauty in my life, even amid chaos and betrayal. Then came a breakthrough, a set of financial documents that revealed discrepancies in the management of my adoptive father's estate. These discrepancies were subtle but significant, a potential avenue for challenging the will and asserting my rightful place. My legal team and I pored over the papers, analyzing every line, every note, every entry. The discovery was empowering, not because it promised revenge, but because it provided clarity and leverage. I felt a sense of control I had never experienced, a recognition that knowledge and preparation could protect me from further erasure. Evenings were still punctuated by reflection. I often found myself on the balcony, looking over the city lights, thinking about the journey I had undertaken. The slap, the betrayal, the kidnapping, and the exclusion from the will had once defined my emotional landscape. Now, they were markers of survival, lessons in resilience, and catalysts for personal growth. I realized that while I could not change the past, I could shape my response, reclaim my identity, and forge a future aligned with my values and integrity. Through it all, I also began mentoring younger women in my community who had faced betrayal or abandonment. Sharing my experiences, offering guidance, and witnessing their growth became a source of purpose and healing. I realized that my journey, painful as it had been, could inspire others to reclaim their own narratives, find strength in adversity, and assert their autonomy in the face of betrayal. By the end of this phase, I had transformed from a girl defined by loss and exclusion into a woman fortified by knowledge, resilience, and purpose. The slap, the exclusion, and the revelation of my kidnapping remained part of my story, but they no longer controlled me. I had reconstructed my identity, built meaningful connections, and gained strategic understanding of the legal and emotional landscapes that had once confined me. One particularly quiet evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by documents, letters, and photographs. I held a photo of myself as a toddler, wrapped in the blanket Claudia had kept for decades. I thought about the girl I had been, the woman I had become, and the journey that lay ahead. I whispered softly to myself, I am more than the betrayal, more than the stolen years, more than his cruelty. I am my own person, and my story is mine to write. For the first time, I felt a sense of completeness, not in the sense of having healed every wound or reclaimed every lost moment, but in the sense of having reclaimed agency over my life. I was no longer a passive participant in my own story. I was an active author, wielding the power of knowledge, resilience, and self-awareness to shape my present and future. The journey was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. I was ready to face whatever came next, fortified by the realization that I had survived the worst, and that survival had transformed me into someone unstoppable. The months that followed marked a turning point. I had moved from shock and confusion into a phase of deliberate action. I was no longer simply reacting to the betrayals that had defined my adoptive life. I was strategically navigating them, reclaiming autonomy, and reconstructing the narrative of who I was. At 27, the experiences that once made me feel powerless now became fuel for self-empowerment. I had learned that strength was not about vengeance alone. It was about understanding, preparation, and asserting control over what I could influence. One crisp morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with a renewed sense of purpose. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the polished wooden floor. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint scent of old leather books lining the walls. My attorney, A calm woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an unwavering presence looked up from a stack of documents. "Lila," she said, "we've found something significant. Your father's advisors may have overlooked certain clauses that could impact the inheritance claims. It's not just about money. It's about fairness and truth." I felt a surge of determination. The slap, the exclusion, the emotional manipulation, all of it had left scars, but now I had the opportunity to confront the structural injustices with clarity and strategy. I realized that while my father's cruelty had shaped part of my story, it could no longer dictate the trajectory of my life. I could navigate the labyrinth of legal and emotional complexity with precision and poise. In parallel, I deepened my connection with my biological family. Claudia had become a constant presence, her warmth and insight guiding me through the maze of rediscovered identity. Our conversations were long, sometimes tearful, often filled with laughter as we recounted stories from my early life. I began to feel a sense of belonging that I'd been denied for decades, a comforting reminder that family could be chosen, nurtured, and rebuilt, even when the past had been stolen. I also spent more time with my biological father. Our relationship was still tentative, yet it was real, authentic, and grounded in honesty. He shared memories of my infancy, regrets about missed years, and hopes for what we could build together. In his presence, I felt the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. For the first time, I understood that while bloodline could not undo the past, it could provide context, understanding, and a foundation for future connection. Meanwhile, my adoptive father remained a looming figure, though his significance had shifted. He no longer had the emotional power over me that he once did, but the legal and financial complexities he controlled were still formidable. Each interaction with his lawyers tested my patience and resolve. Emails carefully worded, phone calls that required meticulous notes, meetings that demanded composure and poise. They were all exercises in maintaining control, asserting my rights, and refusing to be undermined. The slap still haunted me, especially on nights when memories surfaced unbidden. I would lie awake, reliving the sting, the humiliation, the sense of invisibility that had accompanied it. But I had learned to process these moments differently. Instead of allowing them to provoke despair, I transformed them into a measure of resilience. Every pang of anger or sorrow was a reminder that I had survived, that I had navigated betrayal with clarity, and that I could continue to reclaim my narrative on my own terms. During this time, I also began exploring the professional landscape of my adoptive father's business empire. I wanted to understand not out of greed, but out of necessity. Knowledge was power. I spent hours analyzing reports, reviewing corporate structures, and speaking with insiders. Each discovery provided insights, clarifying patterns of decision-making, potential oversights, and opportunities. I realized that while the slap and the exclusion from the will had been deeply personal betrayals, they were also part of a broader system of control and influence that I now had the tools to navigate. The legal process progressed slowly, with moments of tension that tested my resolve. Every hearing, every document submission, every cross-examination required careful preparation and strategic thinking. My attorney guided me, but it was my persistence, attention to detail, and emotional fortitude that sustained the momentum. I was no longer simply a victim. I was an active participant, asserting my presence, claiming my rights, and refusing to be sidelined. Amid the legal maneuvering, I continued nurturing personal growth. Therapy sessions became more introspective, exploring not just the trauma, but also the lessons embedded within it. I reflected on the complexities of trust, the nuances of family dynamics, and the boundaries I needed to establish to protect myself. Meditation and journaling became daily rituals, anchoring me in a sense of self that was independent of betrayal, inheritance, or past cruelty. One afternoon, as I walked through a quiet neighborhood park, the sun filtering through autumn leaves, I thought about the woman I had been and the woman I had become. The child who had been kidnapped, the girl who had been slapped, the young woman excluded from a multi-million-dollar will. All of them were part of my story, yet none defined my entirety. I whispered to myself, I am more than their decisions. more than their betrayals. I am my own story. The statement, simple yet powerful, became a mantra, a source of daily strength. I also began to consider my future in a broader sense. The financial independence I was reclaiming, the legal clarity I was establishing, and the emotional resilience I had cultivated allowed me to envision a life beyond survival. I began thinking about investments, career growth, and personal ambitions that were previously overshadowed by uncertainty and control. For the first time, the concept of choice became tangible. I could shape my life deliberately, guided by my values, vision, and self-worth. During this period, I received unexpected news from one of my adoptive father's longtime associates. There had been irregularities in the management of certain assets, oversights that could provide leverage in the legal challenge. My attorney and I pored over the documents, analyzing every detail, every anomaly, and every line of communication. It was painstaking work, but it reinforced the idea that knowledge and preparation could counteract years of manipulation and control. Each discovery, no matter how small, became a building block for reclaiming what had been withheld from me. As the weeks turned into months, my network of support strengthened. Friends, mentors, and family members provided not just guidance but also validation. Their perspectives reminded me that my worth was intrinsic, not contingent upon wealth, approval, or inheritance. Every conversation reinforced my autonomy. Every shared laugh restored a sense of normalcy, and every act of kindness reminded me that genuine connection could exist outside betrayal and manipulation. Amidst these developments, I also explored creative avenues that had been neglected during years of subordination. Painting, writing, and small personal projects became acts of self-expression, symbols of autonomy, and a reminder that my life could be shaped intentionally. Each brushstroke, each written word, each organized space reinforced the idea that I was reclaiming my identity in both tangible and emotional ways. There were still moments of doubt. The slap, the betrayal, and the kidnapping were heavy memories, capable of triggering insecurity, fear, and frustration. But I had learned to navigate these moments with grace and strategy. Therapy, reflection, and purposeful action transformed fear into clarity, doubt into preparation, and grief into determination. I realized that the path forward was not about erasing the past but integrating it, learning from it, and using it as a guide for deliberate, empowered action. I also began mentoring younger women who had faced betrayal, abandonment, or identity challenges. Sharing my story, offering guidance, and witnessing their growth became a source of purpose and healing. I realized that the strength I had cultivated through adversity could be multiplied by helping others reclaim their narratives, assert autonomy, and discover resilience. Each mentorship session reinforced the lesson that personal power was not just about self-preservation, it was also about lifting others while navigating life's challenges. By the end of this phase, I had transformed from a woman defined by betrayal, loss, and exclusion into someone fortified by knowledge, resilience, and self-awareness. I had developed a strategic understanding of legal and emotional landscapes, cultivated meaningful relationships, and reclaimed control over my life narrative. The slap, the exclusion from the will, and the kidnapping remained part of my story, but they no longer dictated my trajectory. They were chapters, not definitions. One evening, I sat on my apartment balcony, city lights stretching below like a constellation of possibilities. I reflected on the journey. The slap, the exclusion, the kidnapping, the legal battles, the reconnection with biological family, and the cultivation of personal and emotional strength. I realized that survival had been transformative. Each challenge had carved resilience into my being, each betrayal had honed my clarity, and each moment of reflection had fortified my identity. For the first time, I felt truly empowered. Not because the past had changed, not because the injustices had been erased, but because I had reclaimed agency over my life. I was no longer a passive participant. I was an active architect of my destiny. The journey was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid. I was ready to face the final challenges with strategy, courage, and self-assuredness. And in that quiet moment, as I looked out over the city, I whispered to myself, I am not defined by betrayal, stolen years, or exclusion. I am defined by my resilience, my truth, and my power to reclaim my story. It was a declaration, a promise, and a testament to the strength I had cultivated, a strength that would guide me into the final chapters of this journey. The day the final hearing was scheduled, I woke up with a strange mixture of nerves and determination. I was 27, and the journey from confusion, betrayal, and heartbreak to clarity, resilience, and empowerment had been arduous, exhausting, and at times almost unbearable. Yet here I was, standing on the precipice of the culmination of years of investigation, legal strategy, and personal growth. I had learned to transform every scar, the slap, the exclusion from the $250 million will, the knowledge of my kidnapping, into fuel for action, clarity, and agency. As I prepared for the hearing, I chose my outfit deliberately, a tailored navy suit that conveyed professionalism, composure, and authority. Every detail mattered: polished shoes, neatly styled hair, a subtle fragrance that gave me confidence. This was not just about appearances. It was about embodying the transformation I had undergone. I had been a girl defined by circumstances, but now I was a woman who commanded attention, respect, and dignity. In the courthouse lobby, the air was thick with tension, a mixture of hushed conversations, rustling papers, and the distant echo of proceedings from other rooms. My attorney met me with a reassuring smile and a firm handshake. "Lila, we're ready," she said. The weight of her words anchored me, reminding me that I was not alone in this fight, that the meticulous preparation we had undertaken would guide the proceedings, and that my voice, my truth, was now being heard. As we entered the courtroom, I noticed my adoptive father seated at the front, flanked by his lawyers. His eyes briefly met mine, and for the first time in years, I saw something unfamiliar, a flicker of unease, perhaps recognition of the resolve I had cultivated. He had underestimated me for decades, dismissed my value, and attempted to erase me from both his life and his will. But now, standing there, I felt an unshakable confidence that the narrative had shifted. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer powerless. The proceedings began with procedural formalities, but soon moved into the substantive issues: the validity of the exclusion in the will, discrepancies in the management of assets, and the legal implications of my kidnapping. My attorney presented evidence, highlighted irregularities, and strategically navigated every objection. I watched carefully, noting reactions from the judge, my adoptive father, and his legal team. Each exchange was a reminder of the power of preparation, clarity, and composure. When it was my turn to speak, I rose with a calm but firm presence. I recounted my experiences, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a testament to truth, resilience, and the right to justice. I spoke of the slap that had humiliated me, the exclusion from the will that had attempted to erase me, and the revelation of my kidnapping that had upended my understanding of identity. I recounted the painstaking effort to uncover the truth, to reconnect with my biological family, and to assert my rightful place in the narrative of my life. Every word was deliberate, every detail poignant, every emotion controlled yet authentic. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the documents we had submitted. I noticed my adoptive father shift in his seat, his confident demeanor slightly diminished. For decades, he had wielded power through control, intimidation, and secrecy. But now, faced with irrefutable evidence, meticulous documentation, and my unwavering presence, that power was tempered. I realized, in that moment, that true authority did not come from wealth, fear, or exclusion. It came from truth, integrity, and resilience. As the hearing progressed, my attorney methodically presented the findings regarding the irregularities in the estate, the legal implications of my kidnapping, and the moral and ethical obligations that my adoptive father had neglected. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every legal precedent reinforced my position. I could feel the shift in energy within the room, the subtle acknowledgement that for the first time, the scales were tipping toward justice. Throughout the process, I remained composed, though inside, a whirlwind of emotions swirled. The memory of the slap, the sting of betrayal, and the years of exclusion were still present, but they no longer dictated my actions. I had learned to channel that energy into focus, precision, and determination. My voice was not just heard. It carried weight, authority, and conviction. After hours that felt like both minutes and eternities, the judge adjourned to deliberate. In the quiet moments that followed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From the confusion and pain of my youth, through the discovery of my kidnapping, the painful interactions with my adoptive father, and the painstaking reconstruction of my identity, I had transformed. I was no longer a girl defined by betrayal. I was a woman empowered by resilience, knowledge, and agency. When the verdict was announced the following week, it was both a relief and a culmination. The court acknowledged the irregularities, recognized my rightful claims, and established provisions that ensured both justice and fairness. My adoptive father's exclusion in the will was overturned in part, and reparations were structured to account for the injustices I had endured. The legal resolution was not merely about money, it was about acknowledgement, validation, and the restoration of agency. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I felt a profound mixture of triumph and closure. The slap, the exclusion, the kidnapping, they remained as part of my story, but their power over me had diminished. I had reclaimed authority over my life, asserted my voice, and transformed past betrayal into a foundation for growth, resilience, and empowerment. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated time to nurturing relationships that had been neglected or disrupted. Claudia, my biological mother, became a constant presence, a source of guidance, comfort, and unconditional love. Together, we revisited memories, created new ones, and built a familial bond that had once been denied to me. My biological father also remained involved, offering insights, support, and companionship that strengthened my sense of identity and belonging. The experience also inspired me to support others who had faced similar betrayals. I began mentoring young women who had experienced family estrangement, identity confusion, or emotional manipulation. Sharing my journey, offering guidance, and witnessing their growth became an act of healing, not just for them, but for myself. I realized that resilience could be multiplied, that strength could ripple outward, and that the narrative of survival could empower both oneself and others. Meanwhile, I continued to cultivate personal and professional growth. My career, once overshadowed by uncertainty and familial conflict, now flourished. I engaged in projects that challenged me, opportunities that inspired me, and relationships that were mutually respectful and affirming. The lessons I had learned from betrayal, loss, and resilience informed every decision, every interaction, and every choice. I was no longer a passive participant in my life. I was its architect. There were moments of reflection, of course, when the memories of the slap and the emotional manipulations resurfaced. But these reflections were no longer sources of pain. They were reminders of survival, courage, and transformation. I could acknowledge them without being consumed, integrate them without being defined by them, and use them as a compass to navigate future challenges. One evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I reflected on the years of turmoil, discovery, and empowerment. The lights below shimmered like distant stars, each one a symbol of possibility, resilience, and hope. I thought about the girl I had been, the betrayals I had endured, and the woman I had become. I whispered to myself, I am more than the slap, more than the exclusion, more than stolen years. I am whole. I am powerful. I am my own. The words felt like a mantra, a declaration, and a shield against the shadows of the past. Over time, I also focused on integrating all aspects of my identity. The child who had been kidnapped, the girl who had been betrayed, and the adult who had reclaimed her life all coexisted within me. I realized that wholeness was not about erasing pain, but about embracing it as part of a larger narrative of survival, growth, and empowerment. Each chapter, no matter how painful, contributed to the person I had become, a person capable of facing adversity with clarity, resilience, and grace. The reconciliation with my biological family provided a sense of grounding that had long been absent. Holidays, shared meals, and candid conversations reinforced belonging, connection, and authenticity. I discovered that family was not merely a legal or financial construct. It was love, trust, presence, and mutual respect. These relationships, carefully nurtured and thoughtfully maintained, became a source of stability and joy in a life that had once been defined by uncertainty and loss. In retrospect, I understood that the slap, the exclusion from the will, and the revelation of my kidnapping were not solely tragedies. They were catalysts. They forced me to confront my vulnerabilities, to navigate betrayal with clarity, and to assert my agency in ways I might never have otherwise discovered. The pain was undeniable, but the growth, empowerment, and resilience that emerged from it were equally undeniable. By the time I turned 28, I had created a life defined by choice, integrity, and self-determination. I had reclaimed my voice, rebuilt my sense of belonging, and cultivated relationships that were authentic and affirming. I was no longer a passive participant in my story. I was its author, crafting each chapter with intention, courage, and wisdom. And so, as I stood on my balcony one last evening reflecting on the journey, I allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. I had survived betrayal, discovered the truth of my origins, navigated legal and emotional complexities, and emerged empowered. The slap, the exclusion, the kidnapping, they were chapters in my story, but they no longer defined its ending. I whispered to myself, I am not what they tried to make me. I am what I chose to become. I am whole. I am powerful. I am free. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it.